Welcome to a gentle journey through the twilight echoes of the medieval world. Settle in and let your thoughts drift as we wander together through the moments and objects that shaped the Middle Ages. As the evening unfolds, allow the distant past to come quietly to life around you. In the 9th and 10th centuries, as the sails of Viking longships filled with coastal winds and dark hulls cut through northern waters, the story of their crews reflects more than the deeds of legendary warriors. These maritime expeditions, famed for their swiftness and surprise, drew not only noblemen and seasoned fighters from Scandinavian homelands, but also a significant number of peasants. Daily life for these peasants was governed by the rhythms of the land, but the promise and peril of the sea called to many. Social pressures, the lure of wealth, and the weight of tribute payments to local chieftains all played their parts in this shift. Many Scandinavian communities faced population growth that outpaced the fertility of their farmlands, forcing younger sons and poorer freemen to seek opportunity elsewhere. The burgeoning networks of trade and intermittent harvest failures left many peasants with a difficult choice: remain tied to struggling farms, or join the departure of longships that waited along the fjords, destined for British, Irish, and Frankish coasts. As rowing, navigation, and raiding required able bodies and determined spirits, peasants became essential to the ranks of Viking crews. The need for manpower meant that recruitment was widespread, often reaching deeply into rural villages where food was scarce and prospects were slimmer still. With the increased participation of peasants, Viking raids became more frequent and far-reaching. The infusion of new blood allowed for larger raiding parties and settlements, fueling not only violence, but also trade and cultural exchange across the North Atlantic world. Longships, once the prerogative of chieftains and their retinues, bristled with rowers whose calloused hands had more often held plows than swords. Over time, this blending of social classes at sea transformed both Scandinavian society and the lands they touched. Wealth and influence broadened beyond an elite warrior caste as ambitious peasants returned home bearing foreign silver, goods, and stories. The experience gained through raiding also spread new ideas, technologies, and contacts, subtly altering the social fabric of both the Viking homelands and the places they encountered. Thus, the involvement of peasants in Viking longship crews was no mere footnote. It helped to power an age of expansion that would ripple through Europe and beyond, changing the lives and fortunes of ordinary people, while weaving new threads into the tapestry of medieval history. In the quiet dawn along the Icelandic coast, as mist curled above dark waters, the sound of longships preparing for their daily voyage was familiar and enduring. Central to their movement were the slender wooden arms that pulled these powerful vessels across seas and rivers, the oars, gripped firmly by Viking hands. Yet beneath each oar, almost unseen and often overlooked, was the Viking oarlock, an unassuming but essential piece of craftsmanship that held a place of silent honor in the saga of Norse exploration. The Viking oarlock, typically carved from dense hardwood, or sometimes shaped from antler or bone, was more than just a notched peg or a ring. Its purpose was to cradle the oar, to guide and steady it as rowers surged in unison, their rhythm the heartbeat of the ship. Each oarlock revealed the touch of its maker, sanded smooth by patient hands, oiled and checked for imperfections. You could feel the slight grain of the timber even after years of use, a tactile history etched by salt and time. Some were adorned with carvings, lines and patterns echoing the ancient artistry of the North, serving as both protection and quiet expression of the rower's identity. In use, the oarlock became a living hinge between sailor and sea. Each pull and release sent vibrations up through the oar, transmitted through the oarlock into the thwarts and hull, and into the hands that steered the ship's course. When storms rose and waves battered the hull, the strength of the oarlocks became the difference between progress and peril. Trust in these small, sturdy fixtures was as deep as the ocean itself, for in the Viking world, a ship's crew depended utterly upon their vessels and every single component within them. Beyond mere utility, the oarlock spoke to the fabric of daily Viking life. Whether on wide raids across distant coasts, or in the quieter labor of fishing and trading along fjords, the oarlock's familiar creak and clack were part of the day's soundscape. It was a constant companion on journeys great and small, threading together the work of hands, the dreams of wanderers, and the enduring saga of people whose lives were bound to the sea. In every weathered notch and polished surface, the Viking oarlock tells a story not just of voyages past, but of a way of life anchored in resourcefulness, community, and the ceaseless call of unknown horizons. As the sun blazed upon the shimmering surface of the Mediterranean, the great fleets of galleys that ferried armies and supplies during the Crusades cut their way through the water. These long, slender warships became the backbone of Christian maritime power, crucial for projecting force across the sea. In the early years, galley rowing was largely the work of specialized oarsmen, sometimes hired professionals or convicts drawn from port towns with generations of nautical skill. Yet as the crusading expeditions grew more ambitious and frequent, demands on manning the fleets outpaced traditional sources. The kings and nobles who organized these holy wars turned in desperation to the rural heartlands, pressing peasants from the fields into the hard labor of the oar. This shift emerged from necessity. As the papal call rallied more crusaders, the logistics of moving thousands of armed men across the water became overwhelming. Shortages of trained seamen and the soaring costs of their employment eroded the reliability of traditional crews. Peasant communities, accustomed to being summoned for feudal levies, were now ordered to supply rowers for the war galleys. For these villagers, accustomed to earth and plow, rather than salt spray and whip, it was an abrupt and often brutal change. Rowing on a Mediterranean galley meant endless hours under merciless sun, living on gruel and stale bread, and enduring the threat of battle, sickness, and the lash. Many never returned home, their fate lost to the waves or the distant ports of the Levant. The widespread use of peasants as rowers transformed both naval warfare and the societies themselves. Ship captains adjusted their expectations and routines to cope with crews unused to the rhythms of the oar, leading to slower travel and, at times, disastrous confusion in the heat of battle. Yet the policy enabled fleets to be built and manned on a scale previously impossible, ushering in an era where mass mobilization reached new heights. Back home, the disruption caused by the absence of so many men strained the rural economy. For the medieval world, the galley rower became a new symbol of the costs and consequences of holy war, linking the distant waters of the Mediterranean to the quiet villages far inland. The echoes of these changes rippled through the centuries, casting a long, somber shadow over the story of the Crusades. In the quiet mist of early dawn, along the gentle sweep of a medieval shoreline, the humble galley oarlock begins its story. Crafted from sturdy wood or sometimes bronze, this deceptively simple object served as the pivot on which the labors of many rowers depended. Shaped and fitted by skilled hands, the oarlock cradled the great sweeping oars that propelled merchant galleys and warships alike, its form honed over generations for efficiency and endurance. The craftsman would select the strongest timber, working it into a slot or ring, fixing it securely along the gunwale of the vessel. Sometimes lined with leather, sometimes left bare, its curves held the promise of steady guidance through shifting tides. To grip the oar hammered into the embrace of the oarlock was to feel the pulse of movement and resistance, a direct connection between human effort and the will of the ship itself. In the heat of battle or the steady, rhythmic work of trading voyages, the creak and groan of the oarlock formed a familiar music, echoing the hard breathing of rowers striving in unison. Rough-worn from ceaseless toil, the wood beneath the hand felt both smooth and splintered, a testament to the endless interplay of force and friction. Through calloused fingers, rowers sensed each vibration as the blade of the oar met the water, every thrust an answer to the oarlock's steadfast grip. Within the world of medieval seafaring, the oarlock was both a tool and a silent companion. It bore witness to whispered prayers before dawn launches, to shouts and laughter as crews rowed together beneath the hot midday sun, and to anxious silences when storm clouds gathered. Although rarely celebrated in illuminated manuscripts or chronicled by court historians, the oarlock played its silent part at the heart of maritime culture. Its constant presence underpinned the connection between land and sea, allowing sailors and traders to bridge impossible distances, to bring home spices, fabrics, and stories from far-off lands. In the broader sweep of medieval society, the oarlock symbolized the patient, unseen labor on which kingdoms depended. Each time a galley slipped free of the harbor, hundreds of oarlocks felt the strain of living hands, shaping the fate of families, fortunes, and nations. Even when ships weathered and time moved on, the remnants of these simple devices, etched with the marks of hands long gone, remained as quiet witnesses to centuries of human endeavor, the soundless fulcrum around which so much motion and history turned. Along the windswept shores of the North Sea, in the centuries we have come to call the Middle Ages, small fishing boats bobbed gently against the movement of the tide. These modest vessels, crafted from sturdy local wood and guided by practiced hands, belonged to the peasant fishermen who lived and worked in coastal communities that dotted the landscape from what is now northern England to the lowlands of Flanders and the coasts of Frisia. Life in these settlements was dominantly shaped by the rhythm of the sea. While agriculture provided sustenance, it was the vast, cold waters of the North Sea that offered both opportunity and risk. For generations, fishing was not merely a source of food, but a means of survival, one that allowed these communities to endure hardships when crops failed and famine threatened the land. The fishermen's day began in the deep blue hours before dawn, as they prepared their basic boats, often nothing more than an open hull, propelled by oars and simple sails. With nets woven by hand, or lines armed with hooks forged by local blacksmiths, they ventured out in search of herring, cod, and flatfish that swam in abundance. These catches were vital, not only as nourishment, but as commodities traded in bustling market towns. The steady supply of fish, especially herring, became essential in fasting periods dictated by the church, further increasing its value. As a direct response to the demand, these coastal communities slowly organized themselves into fishing collectives, sharing knowledge of the fickle currents and dangerous weather, pooling resources to maintain boats, and negotiating rights to access the best fishing grounds. Over time, the importance of these peasant fishermen fundamentally shifted the economic and even the social fabric of the region. Salted or dried fish became central to regional trade, linking even the most isolated fishing villages to merchant networks that stretched across northern Europe. As fishing methods improved and boats grew more seaworthy, the reach and prosperity of these communities expanded. Peasant fishermen, once overshadowed by wealthier landholders and traders, gained new standing and influence in shaping local economies and customs. The humble encounters of villages and tides thus rippled far beyond the shore, helping to forge a distinct culture along the North Sea coast that has endured in various forms into the present day. As dawn crept gently across the water's edge, the medieval fishing net awaited its daily purpose, coiled like a patient serpent in the hands of the fishermen. Crafted by calloused fingers in the quiet glow of a simple hearth, these nets were more than tools. They were lifelines spun from humble threads, their every knot a quiet testament to skill and persistence. Typically woven from strong yet supple plant fibers, like flax or hemp, the netting formed a delicate lattice that felt rough yet flexible to the touch, cool and faintly fragrant with the memory of the fields from which it had come. The weight of it settled evenly across the shoulders when carried to the shore, a gentle burden that promised the day's sustenance. Lowered carefully into the water, the net unfurled with graceful understatement, its mesh expanding to conceal the secrets of its purpose. Sometimes the fisherman would wade waist-deep, feeling the chill of the current seep into his bones, bracing himself as he cast the net with a practiced rhythm. Other times he might work from the wooden edge of a skiff, drawing the net slowly through the surface, eyes attentive to every flicker below. The tactile sensation of the net was always with him, coarse strands pressed into the palm, the weight tugging reassuring as it filled, and the satisfying drag as it was retrieved, heavy with the wriggling promise of fish. In the small villages clustered along rivers and coasts, these nets became more than instruments for food. They carried with them the wisdom of generations, knowledge quietly passed from parent to child, alongside the art of knot tying and the secrets of the water's moods. Repairing a net, hunched in the corner of a cottage on a rainy afternoon, was a communal ritual as well as a necessity, fraught with stories and memories. The presence of fishing nets on walls and in boats marked the cadence of daily life, weaving the rhythms of nature into human routine. The medieval fishing net played a subtle but enduring role in the culture of its age. It was both a symbol of survival and a link to the wider world, as fish caught in local waters made their way to market stalls and grand feasting tables alike. It shaped not only meals, but livelihoods and relationships, entwining the fortunes of the shore dweller with the mysterious depths beyond. In its simplicity lay resilience, bridging the needs of body and spirit in a landscape defined by tides, seasons, and the steady, watchful hands of those who knew the worth of every knot. Along the winding rivers of medieval Europe, broad barges laden with wool, grain, and timber slowly drifted downstream, marking the lifelines of commerce and communication for a continent in transformation. At the heart of this great movement were the peasants, whose hands and backs shaped every mile of progress, often unseen by the chroniclers of their age. These men and women, drawn from humble villages near the water's edge, found themselves integral to the burgeoning river trade as ballast haulers and laborers, performing the strenuous essential tasks that powered the movement of these cumbersome vessels. The rise of river traffic and the need for reliable transport of goods across long distances led to increased demand for such manual labor. Barges depended on proper ballast, usually made up of stones or sand, to ensure stability through shifting depths and currents. Loading and unloading this ballast required sheer physical strength and an intimate knowledge of the rivers. Peasant workers, often hired seasonally or pressed into service by local lords who controlled waterways, would spend long days wading into cold, muddy shallows, hoisting heavy baskets of stones and adjusting the vessel's weight distribution under the wary supervision of barge masters. Their work extended beyond ballast, encompassing the loading of cargo itself, the towing of vessels along banks using ropes and animal power, and the endless maintenance required to keep wooden hulls watertight and afloat. The prominence of peasants in this essential work was a direct result of ongoing population growth, improvements in agricultural production, and the expansion of market towns along Europe's river systems. As trade flourished and demand for transportation soared, river barges grew larger and more specialized, further increasing the need for coordinated, physically intensive labor. For peasants, this work represented both opportunity and hardship. Wages were low and conditions punishing. But participation in seasonal river trade could supplement subsistence farming and draw rural communities into wider economic currents. Over time, the reliance on peasant labor to move goods by river helped transform local economies, encouraging the development of denser, more interconnected trade routes and stimulating industries far from the initial point of harvest or production. Although their contributions rarely found voice in courtly chronicles, the efforts of ballast haulers and manual workers left an enduring imprint on medieval transportation and the shape of everyday life along Europe's riverine highways. Through their endless toil, they helped weave together the scattered settlements of medieval Europe into a more unified, slowly modernizing world. A wooden yoke, unassuming in its form yet profound in its influence, was a fixture of medieval life, its presence stretching from the smallest village pastures to the wine fields that marked the feudal countryside. Crafted most often from strong, flexible wood such as oak or ash, the yoke was carefully whittled and shaped by the skilled hands of local carpenters. Its design was pragmatic, a curved bar intended to rest comfortably across the necks of beasts of burden, or at times the shoulders of people, distributing weight evenly and making the task of carrying or pulling less burdensome. When you imagine the touch of such an object, you sense the coarse yet smoothened grain of aged timber, polished slightly by the persistent contact of animal hide or human skin. To lift a yoke, or to fit one across oxen or a team of horses, was to connect with the land itself, to take up the daily rhythm of folks whose lives were measured out not in hours, but in the progress of plows, carts, and the coaxing of heavy loads along rutted paths. There would be the creak of wood, the steady pressure across your shoulders, a presence both grounding and relentless, reminding the bearer of the labor that shaped each day. In practical terms, the yoke magnified strength through unity. By harnessing two oxen side by side beneath a well-shaped yoke, farmers became capable of tilling tough soils and transporting goods that might otherwise have taken a team of many men to move. This simple tool not only increased efficiency, but also fostered a certain closeness between people and their animals. The care taken to pad and fit a yoke, the repairs made each season, and the rituals of yoking up at dawn all reflected a relationship built on necessity and respect. Beyond the fields, the yoke also seeped into the language and symbolism of the medieval world. To be under the yoke became a common phrase, conjuring images of toil and submission, yet also of resilience and steadfastness. The yoke, through its very ordinariness, became a silent witness to the cycles of planting and harvest, of hardship and sustenance. It was a tool that tethered people quite literally to the land, yet in doing so, it also anchored them within the enduring rhythms of medieval life. Along the sweeping shores of the Baltic Sea, from the 12th century onward, coastal communities grew closely entwined with the brisk rhythms of maritime trade. As towns flourished and demand for raw materials escalated, thousands of peasants from villages scattered through the forests and inlets became quietly indispensable to the intricate workings of Baltic commerce. Their lives, while often dictated by the rhythms of farming and the cycle of the seasons, began to move in step with the surging economic currents washing through northern Europe. Timber, vital for shipbuilding and constructing homes in burgeoning cities like Lubeck and Gdansk, became one of the region's most coveted commodities. Peasant families, with knowledge inherited over generations, took to the forests each winter, felling pines, spruces, and oaks. With deft hands and communal effort, they lashed together bright logs to form massive rafts, ingenious floating bundles designed to travel the wide, meandering rivers that threaded the land. When the spring thaws came and the waters ran swift, these peasants steered their timber rafts toward the coast, navigating unpredictable currents and hazards with remarkable skill. Upon reaching the Baltic harbors, their cargoes were integrated into the ever-expanding fleets that supplied wood not just for local use, but for shipyards and merchants as far afield as the Netherlands and England. Meanwhile, the ports themselves bustled with a new kind of activity. Beyond the docks, peasants found seasonal work laboring to load ships, mend nets, and provision seafarers. Some joined crews and learned the ways of the salt-sprayed trade fleets, ferrying grain, fish, and hides across cold northern waters. Their participation was rarely celebrated in the chronicles of their age, but it profoundly shifted the web of rural life and local economies. Old ties to the land loosened, just a little, as families grew more reliant on the cash earnings and market possibilities opened by Baltic trade. In time, this steady involvement in coastal commerce left its mark. Peasant households gained new sources of income, spurred the growth of small hamlets into lively trading centers, and helped to knit together a vast, bustling network that spanned from Russia's forests to the markets of Western Europe. The changed rhythms of work and exchange would echo along the Baltic shores for generations, quietly transforming both those who toiled in forest and field and the world of commerce that coursed along the water's edge. Among the unsung marvels of medieval ingenuity was the humble timber raft, a creation of wood and rope that quietly shaped the daily rhythms of countless riverside communities. At a glance, the timber raft appeared simple: long, rough-hewn logs bound tightly with vines or sturdy cords, their bark still fragrant and slick from the forest. Yet its apparent simplicity concealed a careful understanding of nature's laws and an intimate connection to the slow-moving power of medieval waterways. Crafting a timber raft began deep within the woods, where men felled straight, buoyant trees, choosing each log for its strength and evenness. Working by hand, they stripped the bark and trimmed away branches, their axes ringing through the stillness of the forest. Each timber was laid side by side at the water's edge, fastened together with a practiced weave of rope, sometimes reinforced with wooden pegs or iron nails. The completed raft was buoyant but solid underfoot, bobbing gently with every subtle current. To stand upon a timber raft was to experience the river with every sense. The world was closer to the water's surface than in any boat. The river shimmered at your feet, and the sounds of its flow echoed against the timber. When heavily laden with fresh-cut logs or goods for distant markets, the raft's slow, steady drift called for careful balance and a steady hand on the guiding pole. The rough surface beneath your boots was cool and moist in the morning dew, or warmed by the afternoon sun, creaking in response to every shift of cargo and crew. The timber raft played a central role in medieval life, beyond its function as a mere conveyor of wood. It was an essential tool for trade, allowing towns and villages far from the great forests to receive the timber needed for building homes, bridges, and cathedrals. Rafting culture wove into the fabric of riverside life, with songs and customs passed down along the water's edge. Raftsmen were respected for their endurance, their knowledge of the river's moods, and their ability to guide their lumbering crafts past rocks, whirlpools, and hungry fords. Through seasons of flood and frost, the timber raft remained a silent partner in the shaping of medieval landscapes and livelihoods, its gentle progress etching invisible paths through the heart of an age. As the medieval world settled into its rhythmic cycles of sowing and harvest, the daily life of the peasantry was marked by enduring obligations to the lord of the manor. These duties extended far beyond the fields and pastures that many imagine when picturing the medieval countryside. Across Europe, especially in regions rich with waterways, rivers, and coastlines, the reach of manorial demands found new forms. Villagers bound to the land were often called upon to serve not only among furrowed rows and forest clearings, but also upon the water. Fishing weirs, barges, and riverboats became unexpected arenas of toil for those whose lot was shaped by feudal custom. Manorial lords, seeking to maximize both their holdings and their influence, recognized that waterways were both vital arteries of commerce and abundant sources of sustenance. The right to fish or to control the movement of goods along rivers was a valuable privilege. So as part of their corvée labor, peasants might be commanded to crew fishing vessels, casting nets or hauling catches intended for the manor's kitchen and market. In other cases, they navigated shallow barges or sturdy transports, ferrying produce, timber, or even people between villages and urban centers. Sometimes these obligations were seasonal, corresponding with the cycles of spawning fish or the busiest market periods. In coastal stretches, fishing took on even greater prominence, with whole manorial economies dependent on the harvest of herring, salmon, or shellfish. Such requirements stemmed from the fundamental structure of feudal tenure, in which payment for access to land came as a blend of rent and service, both fixed and shifting with the needs of the estate. The imposition of these maritime tasks was not always welcomed, as they could pull laborers away from tending their own plots at crucial times. Yet compliance was enforced through the authority of the manorial court, and resistance risked fines or further loss of privilege. Over time, these obligations subtly altered rural society. Exposure to riverine and maritime work expanded the skills and resilience of those who took to the water. The movement of people along rivers encouraged the spread of news and ideas. Gradually, as economic conditions and priorities changed, particularly with the rise of towns and the commutation of labor services for monetary payments, the practice of binding peasants to fishing or transport duties declined. Still, for centuries, these waterborne obligations gave a distinct character to countless communities, shaped by the broad reach of lordly power and the ever-present flow of medieval life along river and sea. At the edge of rippling medieval rivers and along the reed-fringed banks of great lakes, the fishing corvée vessel once played a humble yet essential role in the daily rhythms of village life. Corvée, meaning labor owed as a service to the lord or the community, brought people together for seasonal tasks, where fishing was both obligation and chance for communal gathering. The vessel itself, often no larger than a spread cloak, was crafted with painstaking care from willow or hazel, its latticework interwoven with strips of stubborn oak, bent and shaped by practiced hands in family workshops, or beneath the shade of chestnut trees. In the early morning mist, men and women, young and old, would slit these basket-like vessels into the water, their bodies weighted with the simple expectation of duty. As they gripped the rim of the corvée vessel, their fingertips found the faint roughness left by the artisan's knife, a testament to both necessity and craft. The wood, smoothed by river water and constant use, grew familiar over the years, carrying the marks of many harvests. Within its open weave, glimmering fish would thrash and settle, caught by nets draped inside, a welcome prize that would later be divided according to custom. To hold such a vessel was to feel the link between present toil and ancient tradition, the damp chill of water seeping through woven reeds blending with the warmth of hands that had mastered the art of sustaining the village. The corvée vessel was not only a tool, but a symbol, a vessel of obligation and reward, marking the pulse of the agrarian calendar. Its presence was woven into stories told in the fragrance of wood smoke and fresh catch, in quiet evenings when the village would gather and recount the day's labors beneath a darkening sky. In medieval culture, the fishing corvée vessel shaped more than the watery harvest. It fostered communal ties and reinforced bonds between families, as those summoned to the river shared laughter, stories, and sometimes hardship. The object itself became a quiet witness to the careful negotiation between duty and celebration, providing not only food, but also a sense of identity shaped by lineage and shared endeavor. In the hush of the early dawn, or the golden light of evening, the vessel remains an emblem, quietly reminding us of a world in which survival and kinship went hand in hand along the banks of living water. Across the rivers and coastlines of medieval Europe, the bustle of newly built shipyards became a common sight, shaped as much by the hands of humble peasants as by the vision of merchant guilds and lords. In a world where timber was transformed into the arteries of trade and war, the immense task of building and maintaining these maritime centers fell heavily upon the peasantry, often summoned by lords through feudal obligation or drawn by seasonal wages. Villagers left their fields and homes behind to toil at the edges of marshy rivers and chilly harbors, bringing with them the rhythms of agricultural labor into an entirely new environment. The demand for ships grew steadily throughout the Middle Ages, spurred by expanding trade networks, ambitious crusades, and the defensive needs of kingdoms both great and small. But this demand was not simply a matter of expertise. Before the skilled shipwright could shape the hull or the master carpenter attach the mast, the very foundations of each shipyard had to be laid and endlessly maintained. Massive logs had to be hewn and floated downriver, earthworks built to create flat ground, and channels dug to guide the brackish tides. All of these tasks required labor on a vast scale, drawing peasants into seasonal migrations and binding the rural countryside to the fate of growing ports. As centuries passed, the reliance on peasant labor in shipyard construction gradually changed the landscape of work itself. The experience exposed villagers to unfamiliar technology and fostered new skills, with some finding permanent employment in bustling maritime towns rather than returning to the solitary rhythms of the plow. The shipyards, in turn, reshaped entire communities, drawing fresh corn out of the fields to feed hungry workers and fueling new patterns of trade. While many aspects of medieval life remained rooted deeply in tradition, the calloused hands of peasants at the shipyard marked a quiet but profound shift, linking the fortunes of the humble with the onward sweep of commerce and exploration. In the echoes of hammers upon timber and the creak of freshly assembled docks, one finds the understated story of how medieval societies built not only ships, but bridges between the old world of the land and the vast, ever-changing promise of the sea. Amid the bustling waterfronts of medieval Europe, the scent of brine and sawdust mingled in the air, and the low, resonant hum of labor was never far away. Prominent among the silhouettes of masts and rigging rose the wooden shipyard crane, a testament to the ingenuity and practical necessity of its age. Crafted almost entirely from robust timbers harvested from nearby forests, these machines were feats of both engineering and woodworking skill. Each limestone-weighted treadwheel, beam, and iron-bound pivot was assembled by the careful hands of skilled artisans, many of whom had learned their craft through generations of patient apprenticeship. The crane itself stood as a mighty companion to the shipwrights, laborers, and merchants, whose livelihoods depended on the ebb and flow of maritime trade. Its treadwheel, a massive drum turned by the rhythmic stride of men walking within like hamsters, converted human motion into lifting power, making it possible to hoist timber, barrels, and entire sections of ship hulls with steady, groaning reliability. To grip the thick, smooth handle of the crane, or to step inside the wheel, was to sense the interdependence of muscle and mechanism, timber and metal. Each revolution sent vibrations through the wood, a tactile reminder of the efforts expended in the building and launching of great ships. For those who used it daily, the shipyard crane was not merely a tool, but a trusted partner in the demanding rhythm of dockside life. Its presence shortened hours of grueling labor and made the impossible seem mundane. It drew people together in shared endeavor, from the strongest laborer to the youngest apprentice, each playing their role beneath its creaking arm. The creak of winch and rope became part of the daily soundscape, as familiar as bird song or the slap of water against the hulls, emblematic of a world anchored in physical effort and communal achievement. In the broader sweep of medieval culture, the crane symbolized both mastery over nature and a balance with it. The forests provided its bones, the rivers its stage, and the coordination of many hands made it work. It stood as a proud sign of technological progress in its time, and a reminder that even in a world powered by wind and muscle, innovation and cooperation could yield wonders. For centuries beneath its shadow, ships were born and dreams of distant shores took form, sustained by the sturdy, enduring presence of the wooden shipyard crane. Across the restless waters of medieval Europe, the fate of empires and kingdoms often hinged upon the strength and maneuverability of their fleets. Yet behind the thunder of siege engines and the glint of mail-clad warriors, there labored a class of men whose contribution was seldom celebrated. The humble peasants recruited as oarsmen. Coastal communities vulnerable to raids and invasions frequently found themselves called upon to supply not only their goods and harvests, but also their strongest laborers. When war loomed or rumors of enemy sails reached the shore, local lords and city authorities levied crews from rural villages. Fields would empty as able-bodied peasants were mustered to the waterfront, where the grime of plowing soon gave way to the salt and sweat of rowing galley after galley. This practice unfolded against a backdrop of social necessity and technological limitation. Medieval warships, such as the Mediterranean galleys or the English balingers, relied on human muscle for speed and precision. Wind might be fickle or absent in coastal conflicts, especially during sudden attacks or maneuvers close to shore. Rowing ensured that vessels could cut through still waters, outflank enemies, or rush to defend vulnerable harbors. Often, these peasant oarsmen had little seafaring experience, their calloused hands more familiar with hoes than with oar handles. Yet, their brawn and numbers allowed medieval navies to field flotillas at short notice, bolstering defenses during critical moments of war. The impact of these enforced gatherings would ripple through the countryside. During times when large numbers of villagers were seized for naval duty, agricultural productivity suffered, and local economies faltered. At sea, the oarsmen endured harsh conditions, cramped together on benches below the booming shouts of officers. While some received wages or a share of loot, most returned home drained and largely unrewarded, bearing with them only the memory of splintered oars and the roar of battle. Over time, with the gradual shift towards specialized naval crews and new ship designs that favored sails over oars, the reliance on peasant labor aboard war vessels subsided. Coastal defenses grew less dependent on rural impressment, and the great ships of Europe began to sail forth under the hands of trained seamen, closing a chapter in which the destinies of land and sea merged in the labor of the medieval peasant. The galley slave oarlock stands as a silent relic of the medieval maritime world, a small but essential iron fitting that shaped the rhythm and hardship of life at sea. Forged by the skilled hands of blacksmiths in bustling port cities, the oarlock was designed with strength and endurance in mind. It bore the heavy burden of the ship's long wooden oar, a pivoting cradle on the vessel's side that endured the strain of relentless rowing. The dark, weathered iron was cold to the touch, often pitted and scarred from years of salt and use, a testament to vessels perpetually at the mercy of wind, water, and war. To the men sentenced to row, the galley slave oarlock was as much a part of life as the very shackles that bound their wrists. They would feel the chilling vibration of iron transmitting through the thick oak of the oar, their palms blistering against the rough grain, every stroke echoing through the oarlock in a chorus of creaks and groans. The oarlocks ensured that, even during the heaviest swell or the chaos of battle, the oars bit deep into the water, harnessing the collective strength of the rowers below deck. Making these oarlocks demanded sturdy iron and practiced hands. Blacksmiths shaped each piece upon the anvil, hammering red-hot metal into a horseshoe arch that would cradle the heavy shaft. Each oarlock was riveted or bolted firmly into the bulwark, often custom-made to fit the dimensions of the ship and its crew, the iron slowly taking on the character of the vessel and the touch of hundreds of hands. For the galley's master, these oarlocks represented the control and coordination of men and timber, transforming raw human power into the steady surge of a ship in motion. In the wider culture of the medieval Mediterranean, the galley slave oarlock became a quiet emblem of both oppression and survival. It was a mechanism of discipline, a link in the chain connecting the rulers and merchants above to the suffering and endurance below. Yet in the daily grind of rowing, they grew familiar, almost personal to those condemned to the benches. Despite their grim purpose, oarlocks helped propel fleets that carried armies, pilgrims, and traders between empires and across legendary seas, weaving their utilitarian presence into the grand saga of medieval commerce and conflict. As the sun set over the harbor, and the sound of creaking oarlocks faded with the tide, these humble fittings remained, marked by the echoes of human toil, a reminder of both the ingenuity and hardship that shaped the medieval world. In distant northern ports during the later Middle Ages, the cogs of the Hanseatic League creaked slowly against the damp wooden piers, their broad decks bustling with the quiet labor of peasant sailors. These merchant vessels, stout and high-sided, became the backbone of trade from the Baltic Sea to the North Sea, binding together cities and peoples in a network of commerce that shaped the fortunes of Northern Europe. Yet for the ordinary men who crewed these ships, daily life was defined less by the promise of riches and more by the rhythms of labor and the strictures of social order. Most peasant sailors aboard Hanseatic cogs hailed from rural backgrounds, their hands hardened by farm work, long before they ever grasped a rope or oar. Drawn to the ports by the lure of wages, or pressed into service through obligations to their lords, they found themselves performing a new and demanding kind of work, far from the safety of their fields. Life at sea required constant vigilance. Tasks ranged from patching sails with crude needles to manually bailing bilge water, with little respite from the endless chores demanded by the sea's unpredictability. Food on board was meager and often stale, barrels of salted fish, tough bread, and dried peas, while fresh water soured quickly in the rolling motion of the ship. Social status among these sailors was deeply rooted in the medieval hierarchy. Despite the vital nature of their work, peasant sailors occupied a low position both ashore and afloat. Shipmasters and notable merchants, often from wealthier city families, held authority and received the lion's share of profits. Guilds and town councils set strict rules, reserving privileges and rights for those born to higher station or granted membership through considerable means. The sailors themselves were viewed as expendable labor, easily replaced and rarely rewarded with advancement or lasting security. The rise of the Hanseatic League itself marked a broader shift in the organization of trade and labor. As towns grew and commerce flourished along the cold northern coasts, demand for maritime transport surged, drawing more rural people into the orbit of the great merchant fleets. For many, this meant a move away from manorial servitude while offering fleeting prospects for higher wages or occasionally a new life in the bustling trading centers. Still, these changes brought little improvement to the underlying social order. Hardships at sea, the perils of storm and piracy, and the unyielding expectations of medieval authority ensured that most peasant sailors remained tethered by the same limits that bound their kin on land. Over time, the context of their work, exposed to different languages, goods, and cultures, allowed for the faintest widening of horizons. But for the majority, the cargoes they hauled and the wealth they enabled did not translate into personal fortune or significant social ascent. Instead, their legacy persists in the silent records of ship logs, town rolls, and the worn stones of the harbors, where the everyday exertion of countless ordinary men underpinned a league whose influence rippled far beyond the planks of any single merchant cog. Turn your imagination to a bustling harbor at the edge of a medieval town. Canvas sails ripple in the breeze, and amidst the steady creak of wood and the low hum of distant voices, barrels line the decks of sturdy ships. These wooden barrels, so familiar to the hands of sailor and stevedore alike, were more than simple containers. They were an essential thread in the fabric of medieval life. Crafted with careful skill by coopers, each barrel was an object of respect as much as utility. To build a shipborne barrel, the cooper would select well-seasoned oak or other hardwood, splitting the wood into long, curved staves. These pieces were shaped with precise artistry, each one fitting tightly alongside its neighbors. With iron hoops pounded into place and the seals tested by eye and ear, the barrel took on its rounded, harmonious silhouette. When held, it felt reassuringly solid, smooth to the fingers, with a gentle bulge beneath the palm. The scent of the wood mingled with the tang of the sea or the sweetness of its stored goods, evoking the rhythms of both forest and ocean. On board ship, the barrel was a silent companion to every voyage. It preserved fresh water for the crew's survival, held salted fish and dried grains to feed them on long journeys, and protected wine or ale from the sun's fierce rays or the lurch of the waves. Rolling along gangplanks and fitting into the hold's dim spaces, barrels were easy to transport, and their rounded shape prevented damage, unlike rigid chests or pots. In the crowded, shifting world of a merchant or warship, the barrel's reliability was never taken for granted. Beyond the decks, barrels were woven into daily routines ashore. In bustling marketplaces and quiet storerooms, they kept spices, pickles, and preserves safe from spoilage or theft. During feasts in great halls, ale flowed from them into waiting mugs, and so the humble barrel joined the gatherings and celebrations that stained the memory of those who lived in its shadow. In all these ways, the wooden shipborne barrel was not merely a vessel, but an enduring symbol of the world's interconnectedness and of the timeless craft that shaped ordinary objects into lifelines for communities everywhere. Across the medieval landscapes of Europe, rural communities were shaped not only by the rhythms of the plow and the cycles of the harvest, but by the relentless pull of the sea. In coastal regions and along riverbanks, peasant households looked beyond the fields, seeking opportunity and necessity in maritime service. For many, the call to serve aboard ships, whether in fishing fleets, merchant convoys, or naval expeditions, brought both challenge and transformation, altering patterns of daily life and community relations in ways that would echo through generations. The roots of this change lay in the demands of expanding trade networks and the growing assertiveness of feudal lords and monarchs who relied increasingly on naval power. Market towns and budding ports clamored for goods from distant shores, while rulers levied obligations for ship service or pressed local men into naval campaigns. For peasant families, participation in maritime work often meant a blend of compulsion and opportunity. While some were required to supply labor or materials for shipbuilding and manning vessels, others grasped at the prospect of supplemental income or escape from the rigidities of agrarian servitude. This growing entanglement with maritime service had profound effects on rural life. For households, the regular absence of working men reshaped the rhythms of labor on the land, compelling women, children, and the elderly to assume heavier burdens in the fields. Hard-won skills and knowledge of navigation or shipcraft filtered back into the village, subtly elevating the status of those who returned with tales of distant ports and unfamiliar customs. Communities once tightly bound by the cycles of sowing and reaping now found themselves linked to far-off cities and the vast, uncertain world beyond the nearest headland. Over time, the maritime experience loosened some traditional bonds, altering obligations owed to feudal lords and creating new channels for economic advancement. The influx of wages and trade goods, though uneven, softened the most rigid forms of dependency, allowing a handful of peasants and their families to negotiate for better terms or even to rise above their station. Yet these changes brought their own anxieties, weakening customary arrangements and exposing communities to the risks and instabilities of far-reaching commerce and war. Thus, the tides of the medieval sea carried more than ships and sailors. They set in motion a gradual reorganization of rural society, as the call of distant horizons reshaped both the fortunes and the fabric of villages that lay beneath the long shadow of castle, church, and coast. In the rhythms of medieval village life, the fishing net formed an unassuming yet indispensable presence, crafted by patient hands along riverbanks or in tiny harbors. These nets began as humble strands of flax or hemp, hand-spun and twisted with care. Local weavers, knowledgeable in both the properties of natural fibers and the needs of their community, would braid and knot the material into wide, shimmering sheets. The result was a tool both strong and supple, ready to meet the gentle pull of the current or the sudden weight of writhing fish. As dawn broke on a misty morning, a medieval fisherman might sling his net over his shoulder, its cool, damp threads brushing against rough-spun tunics and weathered skin. Carrying the net to the water's edge, he would stand with bare feet sunk into mud and reeds, the texture of the net digging lightly into his calloused palms as he readied his throw. With practiced grace, the fisherman would cast the net outward, its mesh billowing and sinking beneath the surface in a silent embrace. The water, gripped by the early light, felt cold and alive, and the net became an extension of the fisherman's will, connecting him to the patient pursuit of life within the stream. The fruits of this quiet labor reached far beyond the fisherman's evening meal. Catches gathered from the nets filled baskets in local markets, feeding families and fueling the small economies of riverside hamlets. Villagers swapped stories and news as they mended tears in the mesh, using bone needles and time-worn fingers to ensure nothing was wasted. Church feasts, monastic fasting, and the rhythms of Lent all depended on the bounty brought up by these simple hand-woven nets, linking the object to the spiritual life that suffused the medieval calendar. As the sun set and the nets hung to dry on wooden pegs, their presence spoke of more than sustenance. They represented inheritance, as net-making skills passed from parent to child, old wisdom entwined with new. The fishing net, in all its patient artistry and daily usefulness, was both a symbol and a tool, drawing together the shared hopes, labors, and traditions of medieval folk, shaping the pattern of their days as surely as the river carved its course through the land. Thank you for wandering with me through the quiet halls and winding paths of the medieval world this evening. May the echoes of history bring you comfort and peace as you drift into restful sleep.